The sun poured through the old curtains of George Thompson's modest little home, the light casting warm golden stripes across the small kitchen table. It was just another morning, another day in the quiet town where nothing ever really happened, or so it seemed. George woke early, as he always did. At 72, the years had slowed him down, but they hadn't dulled his routine. His joints creaked as he swung his legs out of bed, his slippers waiting loyally on the floor. George's house was a reflection of his life, plain, practical, and lived in. The floors creaked like old bones underfoot as he shuffled to the kitchen. The coffee pot gurgled softly as it brewed his usual cup, no frills, just black coffee. Beside the pot, an old ceramic jar sat with its mouth wide open, copper pennies glinting inside. To George, pennies were more than loose change. They were time capsules, each one carrying a memory, a story. He didn't see them as insignificant. Every penny had value, no matter how small. For the last 45 years, collecting pennies had been his quiet obsession. He wasn't sure why it started, not entirely, anyway. Maybe it had been the result of hard times, the kind where every cent counted. Or maybe it had been a way to give himself purpose after his wife, Margaret, passed away so suddenly. Back then, grief had left him feeling like an empty room. So he began to save, 1 penny, then 2, then thousands. On this particular morning, however, George's collection was no longer a secret. His daughter, Lisa, had decided it was time to confront him. She was standing in the living room, hands on her hips, staring at what looked like an army of glass jars, metal buckets, and coffee cans filled to the brim with copper coins. "Dad," she began, exasperated already. "We need to talk about these." George glanced up from his cup of coffee, a smile tugging at his lips. "Morning, sweetheart." "Coffee?" "Don't coffee me, Dad. This is serious." Lisa moved closer, her sneakers crunching against a penny that had somehow rolled free. "I counted them. Do you know how many jars of pennies you have in this house?" 36. 36 jars, Dad. And that's not counting the ones in the garage. George shrugged, clearly unbothered. "Well, there's no harm in saving pennies, Lisa. They don't eat, and they don't make a mess." Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. She loved her father dearly, but she didn't understand this bizarre habit of his. For decades, he had tucked pennies into jars, placed them on shelves, under tables, even in old toolboxes. It was almost as if he had built his life around these tiny copper coins. And for what? "Dad, what are you even saving them for?" Lisa asked, softer now. "You can't take them with you." George didn't answer right away. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked over to the nearest jar. It was heavy, the glass worn and foggy from years of fingerprints. He picked it up carefully, almost reverently, and set it on the table between them. "You remember your mother's laugh?" George asked quietly, his eyes far away now. Lisa blinked, surprised by the question. "Of course." George nodded. "Well, this jar started the year after she passed. I was walking home one evening, and I found a penny on the ground. Heads up, shiny as new. I picked it up and thought to myself, Margaret would have called this lucky." He chuckled softly. "So I kept it. Every time I found another, I thought of her. I didn't spend them because spending them felt like letting go of those memories. I know it sounds silly, but—" "It doesn't sound silly," Lisa said quickly, her expression softening. "It sounds sweet. But Dad, look around. This has gotten out of hand." George looked around, his gaze drifting over the jars that filled every corner of the room. To him, they weren't clutter, they were a lifetime. But he could see the concern in Lisa's eyes, and he didn't want to upset her. "All right," George said finally, relenting. "You win. We'll take them to the bank." Lisa stared at him, stunned. "Really?" George chuckled. "Don't look so surprised. I know when I'm beaten." It took 2 days to prepare. Word spread quickly in their small town that George Thompson was finally cashing in his pennies. Neighbors stopped by, curious and eager to help. Kids from the neighborhood thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen, pennies spilling across the floor like treasure. Even George's old friends from the factory pitched in, lifting heavy buckets and trading jokes about what George might buy with his windfall. "Think you'll get enough for that fancy sports car, George?" one man teased, wiping sweat from his brow. "Only if I can get it in penny installments," George shot back with a grin. But the scale of the task quickly became clear. Pennies were heavy, and there were far more of them than anyone realized. Old coffee cans buckled under the weight. Boxes tore open, spilling coins across the floor. "You're going to break the bank," Lisa muttered as she struggled to lift a particularly full bucket into the back of her car. George stood in the driveway, surveying the organized chaos with a mix of pride and amusement. "Maybe," he said. "But wouldn't that be something?" The journey to the bank was a sight to behold. Lisa's car sagged under the weight of the coins, its suspension groaning in protest. A second neighbor offered his pickup truck, and together, they made their way into town, a caravan of old friends, kids on bicycles, and curious onlookers. People stopped and stared as George's convoy rolled by, the sunlight glinting off the pennies that peeked through cracks in the containers. When they reached the bank, chaos erupted. It was a quiet Wednesday morning, and the small bank had no idea what was coming. The teller behind the counter froze when George walked in, followed by a parade of people carrying heavy boxes and jars filled with coins. Sir," the teller stammered. "Can I help you?" George removed his hat and smiled politely. "I'd like to deposit these." The teller blinked. "All of them?" "All of them," Lisa confirmed, setting down a bucket with a thud that made the floor vibrate. Bank employees emerged from offices, staring at the growing mountain of pennies that now occupied the lobby. A manager appeared, looking pale as he tried to assess the situation. Customers watched with wide eyes as box after box was carried inside, the sheer weight of the coins causing the counter to creak ominously. "I don't think we have enough machines to count all of these," the manager admitted. "Take your time," George said cheerfully. "I'm not in any rush." The bank staff scrambled to accommodate the bizarre request. Large coin-counting machines were brought out, and employees began pouring the pennies into them by the bucketful. The machines whirred and clanked loudly, struggling to keep up with the torrent of copper. At one point, one of the machines jammed, prompting a collective groan from the staff. Outside, news of George's deposit spread quickly. People gathered around the windows to watch, snapping photos and whispering excitedly. Someone called the local news station, and within the hour, a reporter and a camera crew were on the scene. "Sir, can we ask why you've been collecting pennies for so long?" the reporter asked as George leaned against the counter, watching the chaos with a faint smile. George looked into the camera, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Because small things add up," he said simply. "People think pennies don't matter, but they do. Every single one counts." The reporter nodded, clearly intrigued. "And what do you plan to do with the money?" George hesitated, glancing over at Lisa. He hadn't thought that far ahead. To him, the pennies were the point, not what they were worth. "I suppose I'll figure that out when we see how much there is," he said finally. Hours passed, and the machines continued to hum and clatter. Bank employees looked exhausted, their shirts wrinkled and sleeves rolled up as they worked tirelessly to count the pennies. Outside, the crowd grew larger, and the air buzzed with excitement. People debated how much money George might have saved, hundreds, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands. As the sun began to set, Lisa sat beside her father in the lobby, watching as the final jars were emptied. She glanced over at him, her expression softer now. Mom would have thought this was crazy, she said with a small laugh. George smiled, his gaze distant. Maybe. But I think she'd be proud, too. For George, it wasn't about the money. It was about the journey, the years of small sacrifices, the quiet persistence of saving something everyone else overlooked. She pulled into the driveway of George's house, and they sat there for a moment, both unwilling to break the stillness. Finally, George reached for the door handle. "You're staying for dinner, right?" he asked. Lisa hesitated. "Yeah. Sure, Dad." Inside the house, the day's earlier chaos was still evident. The shelves were bare, the dust from where jars had once sat leaving smudges on the wooden surfaces. An odd emptiness hung in the air, as if part of the house's soul had been carried off to the bank along with the pennies. George ran a hand over the spots where the jars used to sit, his fingers tracing the outlines of things long removed. Lisa disappeared into the kitchen and began heating up a pot of leftover stew. The clinking of spoons and the hiss of a gas flame broke the silence as George settled into his old recliner. He leaned back, staring up at the ceiling, as the events of the day replayed in his mind. The bank. The crowd. The noise. He hadn't expected any of it. He hadn't expected to see people's faces light up with curiosity, or to watch their expressions change as they realized that the old man with the jars wasn't as foolish as he seemed. More than anything, he hadn't expected the memories. The smell of the bank, the slightly musty air, the metallic tang of coins, had taken him back 45 years, to the day he found that first penny. He could still see Margaret's smile in his mind, bright and teasing, as she caught him slipping it into his pocket. "A penny, George?" "Really?" she'd laughed, her brown eyes sparkling. "It's lucky," he'd replied. "You're lucky, you big softy," she'd teased, pressing a kiss to his cheek. And that was the start of it, wasn't it? That single moment, so small and insignificant, had planted something in his heart. Margaret had been the kind of person who noticed the small things in life, the way wildflowers poked through sidewalk cracks, the way rain sounded on the tin roof of their first house, the way a penny on the ground could be more than just a coin. When she passed, George lost his ability to see those small moments. Life became a series of empty hours and cold, quiet nights. But when he found that first penny after she was gone, something shifted. It was as if Margaret had whispered to him from somewhere beyond the veil, telling him to pay attention, to keep going. So he did. "Dad?" Lisa's voice brought him back to the present. She stood in the doorway, a steaming bowl of stew in her hands. "You okay?" George blinked and nodded, sitting up straighter. "Just thinking." Lisa handed him the bowl and took a seat on the couch nearby. They ate in silence, the old clock ticking on the wall marking the seconds. "Jake called me earlier," Lisa said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "He saw you on the news." George raised an eyebrow. "My grandson saw me on the news?" "Yeah. Apparently, you've gone viral." "Viral?" George repeated, confused. "Is that good?" Lisa laughed softly. "It means everyone's talking about you. Jake said the video of you and the bank has been shared thousands of times online. He's proud of you." George frowned, chewing his stew thoughtfully. "Why would people care about an old man and his pennies?" "Because it's not about the pennies, Dad," Lisa said gently, setting her bowl on the coffee table. "It's about you. About how something so small became something so big. People love stories like that. It makes them feel like anything is possible." George grunted, unsure of how to respond. He had never been one for attention, and the idea of strangers knowing about his decades-long habit made him feel uneasy. But deep down, he understood what Lisa meant. The pennies weren't really the story. The story was about perseverance, about love, about finding meaning in the seemingly meaningless. As the night wore on, Lisa kissed George on the cheek and headed home, promising to check in the next morning. George watched her car disappear into the dark before locking the door and making his way upstairs. He moved slowly, his knees aching more than usual after the long day. In his bedroom, George sat on the edge of the bed and carefully pulled the slip of paper from his coat pocket. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the number printed neatly in bold black ink. He let out a slow whistle, his chest tightening. It wasn't just a number. It was a lifetime, one penny, one jar, one memory at a time. He set the paper carefully on his nightstand and lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and George could almost hear Margaret's voice again, soft and full of love. "You did good, George," he murmured to himself, closing his eyes. The next morning, George woke to the sound of his phone ringing on the nightstand. He squinted at the clock, 6:15 a.m., and groaned. It wasn't like him to sleep late, and certainly not to wake up to someone calling. He picked up the phone with a gruff, "Hello? Is this George Thompson?" A woman's voice chirped on the other end. "Who's asking?" "This is Karen Mathers with the Good Morning America show. We've seen your story, and we'd love to have you join us for an interview. Millions of people have been inspired by what you've done, Mr. Thompson, and..." George hung up the phone. The idea of cameras, lights, and more questions sent a wave of discomfort through him. He wanted none of it. All he wanted was for things to go back to normal. But, as George would soon discover, once something, or someone, goes viral, normal is no longer an option. By the end of the day, there were reporters at the end of his driveway, neighbors bringing casseroles, just because, and children leaving pennies on his doorstep like small offerings. George sat on the front porch in his rocking chair, watching the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and resignation. One little girl with pigtails and a missing tooth approached him shyly, holding out a single penny in her palm. "This is for you, mister," she said, her voice small but brave. George stared at the penny, his heart squeezing. "Why's that, sweetheart?" "Because you saved them, and I thought you might need one more." For the first time in a long time, George Thompson felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He accepted the penny carefully, his voice thick as he said, "Thank you." That night, as he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by the hum of voices outside and the occasional flash of a news camera, George looked down at the final penny in his hand. It wasn't about the money. It never was. And now, with the whole world watching, George knew he had one more decision to make, one that would change everything. George Thompson stared at the small copper penny on the kitchen table. Its surface was scratched and worn, but its weight in his palm felt immeasurable, far greater than its value. Outside, the soft murmurs of reporters lingered in the night air. From his front porch earlier, George had seen more cars parked along the street, their headlights casting brief beams of light across his yard. The world was watching him now, something he had never expected, much less wanted. The night stretched on. Every creak of the house seemed louder, every sound from outside sharper. George wasn't used to this, a life suddenly thrust into the spotlight. He rubbed his face and looked back at the small slip of paper resting on the table, the final tally from the bank. Over 500,000 pennies. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. Lisa had guessed at the number earlier that day, estimating around a few $1,000s at most, but George had known better. Every single penny mattered, every jar had held its quiet worth. The total had come to a little more than $5,000. Decades of saving had led to this moment, a number that seemed so small when compared to the years he had spent gathering them. Yet George didn't feel disappointment. How could he? For him, those pennies had never been about the money. And yet now, as the reporters huddled outside, the world had assigned their own meaning to his jars. The following morning, George's landline rang relentlessly. By the time the sun had barely begun to creep over the horizon, George had already received calls from morning talk shows, radio stations, newspapers, and strangers who wanted to know his story. Some offered money for exclusive interviews, others simply wanted to say how inspired they were by him. George ignored them all. At exactly 8 a.m., Lisa's car pulled into the driveway, and she stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee. She hesitated when she saw the reporters still lingering on the sidewalk, a few of them perking up as she approached the house. She ignored their calls and questions, quickening her pace until she reached the front door. "Morning, Dad," she said, handing him one of the cups. Her eyes fell on the bags under his eyes and the deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face. "Did you get any sleep at all?" George shrugged. "Not much." Lisa sat across from him at the kitchen table, glancing at the penny still resting in the center. "I can't believe they're still out there," she muttered, nodding toward the window. "It's been 2 days, and they're not letting this go." "Seems like they don't have anything better to do," George said gruffly. Lisa took a sip of her coffee, studying him. "You could tell them the amount, you know. It might make them go away." George shook his head. "That's not their business." "Well, they're going to keep making guesses, Dad. You've gone viral. Jake showed me some videos online last night. People are calling you the Penny Man." "The Penny Man?" George's eyebrows knitted together in confusion. "What does that even mean?" Lisa smiled faintly. "It means people love your story. They're trying to understand why you did it. Half of them are calling it inspirational, the other half think you're crazy." "Maybe I am," George said with a small chuckle, though the laughter didn't quite reach his eyes. He picked up the penny and turned it over in his fingers. "People think the big things in life are what matter most. They don't realize it's the small things that hold everything together." Lisa tilted her head, her expression softening. "Is that why you started saving them? Because of Mom?" George looked up sharply, his eyes meeting hers. For a long time, he didn't say anything, as if the weight of her question had settled over him like a heavy coat. Finally, he nodded. "It was her idea," he said quietly. "Not the saving, exactly, but the way she saw things. She noticed the little things no one else did." His voice wavered, caught in the memories that had been so carefully locked away for years. "She always said life leaves you breadcrumbs. You just have to pay attention to find them." Lisa smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "I miss her too, Dad." George's gaze fell back to the penny, his thumb brushing across its surface. "This isn't just a jar full of coins, Lisa. It's moments. A lifetime of them. Every time I found one, I thought about her. About what she would have seen in it." The room fell silent. For the first time in years, Lisa felt like she was seeing her father clearly, really seeing him. The man who had spent so long in quiet solitude, his heart tucked away behind stubborn silence, was now sharing a piece of himself that she had never fully understood. Before she could respond, a loud knock rattled the front door. Both of them froze, the sound breaking the fragile stillness. "Mr. Thompson. George Thompson. We need to speak with you." Lisa frowned and got up to peer through the peephole. "Reporters again," she muttered. "They're relentless." George waved a dismissive hand. "Ignore them." Lisa turned back to face him, frustration flaring in her voice. "You can't keep ignoring this, Dad. They're not going to leave you alone unless you say something." George stared at her for a long moment, then sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Fine. I'll talk to them." Lisa blinked in surprise. "Wait, really?" He pushed himself up from the chair, his knees creaking in protest. "But only once. I'll tell them what they need to hear so they'll leave me alone." Lisa opened the door, stepping outside as a small swarm of reporters closed in. Cameras flashed, voices called out, and microphones were thrust forward. George followed behind her, his expression stern but calm as he took his place on the front steps. The reporters quieted, the weight of anticipation hanging in the air. "Mr. Thompson," a young woman said, breaking the silence. "You've captured the world's attention with your penny collection. Why did you spend 45 years saving them? Was it for the money?" George raised a hand, and the crowd quieted again. He looked at the sea of faces in front of him, people holding cameras, notebooks, and recording devices. The world was listening now. "It wasn't about the money," George said simply. "It was about what the pennies meant." The reporters shifted, their curiosity piqued. "I saved pennies because someone I loved taught me to pay attention to the little things in life. My wife, Margaret, saw beauty in things most people overlook, like a single penny on the ground. She believed it was a reminder that even the smallest things have value." George's voice carried over the crowd, steady and clear. "After she passed, I kept finding pennies everywhere I went. At first, I thought it was just luck, but over time, I realized it was something more. It was like she was leaving me reminders not to give up. So, I saved them. One by one, year after year." The crowd was silent now, hanging on to his every word. "Those pennies aren't just coins. They're memories. Every single one reminds me of her, of the years we shared, and of the love we had." George paused, his voice thickening slightly. "If saving pennies taught me anything, it's that the small things matter most. And maybe that's something the world needs to remember." For a moment, there was no sound, just the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Then someone clapped. One pair of hands, then another, until the entire crowd was applauding. George felt his face flush, uncomfortable with the attention, but he stood tall, holding his ground. "Mr. Thompson, one last question," a reporter called. "What are you going to do with the money now?" George paused, looking out at the crowd. The answer came to him as naturally as breathing. "I'm going to find a way to give it back to people who need it more than I do." The crowd erupted into murmurs of approval and excitement as cameras clicked and videos rolled. George turned and made his way back into the house, shutting the door behind him. Lisa watched him carefully, pride swelling in her chest. "You did good, Dad," she said softly. George gave her a small smile. "It's what Margaret would have wanted." And as the house fell quiet once more, George sat back down at the kitchen table. He picked up the last penny in his hand, turning it over thoughtfully. Somewhere, deep in his heart, he felt her presence, Margaret's quiet laughter, her warm smile, her soft whisper reminding him that even the smallest things carry the greatest meaning. And for the first time in a long time, George Thompson felt at peace. The morning after George's impromptu statement to the reporters, the town seemed to hum with new energy. It wasn't just the neighborhood anymore, calls were coming in from far and wide, and headlines popped up in newspapers across the country. "The Penny Man's Secret, a Lifetime of Love in Copper. Man collects pennies for 45 years, and it's not about the money. The small things that matter, how one man's story touched the world." George, however, remained firmly inside the four walls of his modest home. To him, nothing had changed. The wind still whistled against the windowpanes, the floors still creaked beneath his steps, and the sound of the kettle on the stove whistling was still the most reliable part of his mornings. But outside, the world was talking. The day started early again, with Lisa returning to check on him. This time, she brought her teenage son, Jake, along. George liked Jake well enough, quiet kid, tall for his age, with a mop of hair that never seemed to sit quite right. He didn't talk much, which suited George fine. "Hey, Grandpa," Jake muttered as he stepped inside. He dropped his backpack onto the floor and plopped himself into the armchair by the window, his eyes darting briefly to the group of reporters still lingering outside. Lisa set a grocery bag on the table, unloading some eggs, bread, and a fresh jug of milk. "I figured you'd need a restock," she said, her tone bright but carrying that undercurrent of worry she always had. "How are you holding up?" "Still breathing," George replied gruffly, stirring his coffee. "They're still out there, aren't they?" Lisa glanced toward the window and sighed. "They're not leaving anytime soon. I heard someone say a producer from one of those big morning shows might come here next week. They want you on live TV, Dad." "Not interested," George replied without looking up. "Dad, I don't think you understand. People love this story. It's given them hope or something. You didn't just save pennies, you saved memories, moments. Everyone's saying it's beautiful." George paused for a moment, his spoon clinking softly against the inside of the mug. "Well, it's not their story to tell," he said finally. Lisa sighed and pulled out a chair across from him. "I know you don't want the attention, but you might want to think about what comes next. You said you'd find a way to give back, that's what people are really latching onto now." Jake, who had been silent up to that point, suddenly spoke up. "You should start a charity or something." Both George and Lisa turned to him. "What did you say?" George asked, narrowing his eyes slightly. Jake shrugged, picking at a loose thread on the armrest. "I said you should start a charity. You saved all that money for so long, but if you want to give it back, you could help people. People love stories like that. They'd probably even send you more money to help." George frowned, sitting back in his chair. "Why would anyone send me money? I'm just an old man who saved some coins." "Because you gave people something to believe in, Grandpa," Jake replied, looking at him now with an expression George couldn't quite place, something between admiration and quiet determination. "Not everything's about money. You said that yourself. People just want to be part of something that matters." The words hung in the air for a long moment. George stared into his coffee, the steam curling upward like a faint ghost. Charity. The word seemed so big, so distant. What did he know about charities or causes? All he'd done was pick up pennies from sidewalks and forgotten corners of the world. How could that possibly turn into something greater? Lisa watched him carefully. "You don't have to decide now," she said gently. "But maybe think about it. Mom would have loved the idea of you helping others." George's chest tightened at the mention of Margaret again, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the window, where a small crowd of reporters still lingered near the sidewalk, their faces hopeful and eager. Jake's words echoed in his mind, people just want to be part of something that matters. The day passed slowly, the way time always seemed to stretch when you had too much to think about. George spent the afternoon in his garage, surrounded by the empty jars and boxes that had once held his pennies. He picked up an old mason jar, turning it over in his hands. How many of these jars had Margaret brought home over the years? She had always loved mason jars, said they were perfect for everything from homemade jams to flowers on the table. Now, they felt like relics of a life long gone. He set the jar down and walked over to his workbench, where a small, dusty radio sat. It hadn't been turned on in years, but George flipped the knob, and to his surprise, it crackled to life. A soft voice floated through the static, some late afternoon talk show discussing the news of the day. George barely paid attention until he heard his name. The story of George Thompson, the man who spent 45 years collecting over 500,000 pennies, has taken the country by storm. People across social media are calling him an inspiration, a reminder that the smallest things can hold the greatest meaning. Some are even starting to donate their own spare change to local charities, using George's story as motivation. It seems his jars of pennies have sparked something far bigger than anyone expected. George froze, his hand hovering over the volume knob. Donations? People were giving away their own change because of him? He turned the radio off, the silence suddenly deafening. That night, George lay awake staring at the ceiling, Margaret's voice whispering in the back of his mind. Life leaves you breadcrumbs. You just have to pay attention to find them. The next morning, George made a decision. At exactly 9 a.m., he walked out onto his front porch, his old leather shoes scuffing against the wood. The reporters turned as one, their cameras lifting, their voices rising in excitement. George raised a hand, and the noise subsided. "I've got something to say," George called out. "But you're going to have to listen close, because I'm only going to say it once." The crowd quieted instantly. George cleared his throat, his voice carrying with surprising strength. For years, people ignored these pennies. They were too small to matter, too easy to overlook. But my wife taught me something. It's the small things that hold everything together. These pennies reminded me of her, of the life we had, of the little moments that made it beautiful. And now, I think it's time to let them do some good for others. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I'm starting something, call it a fund, a cause, a movement, I don't care what name you give it. But every single penny I've saved is going to go toward helping people who need it. Families, kids, people down on their luck. If these pennies taught me anything, it's that the smallest things can make the biggest difference. The crowd erupted into cheers, the reporters shouting questions all at once. George turned and walked back into the house, shutting the door behind him. His hands were shaking slightly, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. By the time the story hit the news that night, the response was bigger than George could have imagined. Donations began pouring in, people sending in their own pennies, nickels, dimes, and dollars from all over the country. Some sent letters, sharing their own stories of love and loss. Others simply wrote, "Thank you for reminding us what matters." Lisa sat beside George as they watched the news coverage. "I told you, Dad," she said softly. "You've started something real." George didn't reply, but as he stared at the screen, showing images of families, schools, and small charities already being impacted by the donations, a quiet sense of purpose settled over him. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he felt like he had found his path. As the days turned into weeks, George's small act of saving pennies blossomed into a movement far greater than he ever could have dreamed. Boxes of coins arrived at his doorstep, people stopped him on the street to shake his hand, and a new warmth filled the once quiet house. One evening, as George sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lisa joined him with a cup of tea. "You know, Mom would be so proud of you," she said quietly. George looked out at the horizon, the colors melting into shades of orange and pink. "I hope so," he murmured. "She always said life leaves breadcrumbs. Maybe this is where they were leading me all along." And in that moment, as the world continued to hum with life around him, George Thompson finally understood what it meant to turn the smallest moments into something timeless. The weeks after George's announcement transformed his life into something he could hardly recognize. Where there had once been silence, there was now an endless buzz of activity. Letters arrived daily in bundles, thick envelopes stuffed with handwritten notes, crumpled bills, and jars of loose change. Each day, a knock on the door signaled the arrival of another delivery, another expression of hope. Lisa had set up a small station in George's dining room to help manage the chaos. The long, wooden table where Margaret used to serve holiday dinners was now covered with stacks of letters, coin-filled jars, and carefully labeled boxes. Every inch of space seemed occupied, but George didn't mind. In fact, he found it comforting in an odd way, like the house was alive again. One morning, as George shuffled into the room, he spotted Jake carefully tearing open an envelope. His grandson had practically moved in over the past few weeks, spending most of his free time sorting coins, reading letters aloud, and occasionally fiddling with an old laptop he'd set up in the corner. "Hey, Grandpa," Jake said without looking up, holding out a letter. "Check this one out." George took the paper, squinting at the neat handwriting. It was from a woman in Kentucky who'd recently lost her husband. Dear Mr. Thompson, I read about your story in the paper, and I wanted to thank you. My husband always said that pennies were God's little reminders. Every time he saw one, he'd pick it up, smile, and tell me it was a sign to keep going, even on the hard days. He passed away last month, and the house has been so quiet without him. But when I read about your pennies, I felt like he was speaking to me again. Enclosed is his jar of pennies. We started it 20 years ago. Please use it to help someone who needs it. It's not much, but it's given me hope again. Thank you for reminding me that small things matter. With gratitude. Evelyn C. George's throat tightened as he lowered the letter. Jake watched him, waiting for a reaction. God's little reminders, George murmured to himself. He looked at the jar Jake was holding, a mason jar, the glass a little foggy from age. It wasn't even halfway full, but to George, it might as well have been solid gold. That's not the only one, Jake said quietly. We've gotten at least 20 letters like that this week. People are sending their pennies to help out. George sank into his chair, staring at the table. 20 jars. 20 people who had held on to pennies not because of their monetary value, but because of what they symbolized. God's little reminders. He wondered how many of those tiny copper coins had been overlooked, stepped on, and forgotten by people rushing through their lives. And yet, for those who paid attention, they were something more. Lisa walked into the room then, holding a steaming cup of coffee for George. She paused when she saw the look on his face. Everything okay? George nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the letter. It's bigger than I thought, he said softly. All of this, it means something to people. Lisa smiled, setting the cup in front of him. It does. You've given people a reason to believe again, Dad. That's no small thing. The word sat heavily in George's chest. He'd never set out to become anyone's inspiration. Saving pennies had been a private act, something he'd done for Margaret and for himself. But now, the world had grabbed hold of it, and it was growing into something he couldn't control. Part of him wanted to pull back, to shut the door and let the noise die down. But another part, a part he'd long ignored, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. That afternoon, Lisa suggested they go for a walk. You've been cooped up too long, she said, practically pulling George out of his armchair. Let's get some fresh air. Reluctantly, George agreed. The sun was bright but not overbearing as they strolled down the familiar streets of his neighborhood. George's cane tapped softly against the pavement with each step, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the quiet of the world again. But as they walked, George began to notice something strange. Every few houses, there were children on the sidewalks, bent over, searching the cracks and edges of curbs. Some had small jars or bags with them, and others simply clutched pennies in their tiny fists. Are they looking for coins? George asked, his brow furrowing. Lisa smiled. Yeah, it's a new thing. Didn't you hear? Kids everywhere are starting to pick up pennies. Parents say your story has them paying more attention, finding value in little things. They're calling it the pennies with purpose trend. George stopped walking, leaning heavily on his cane. Across the street, a little girl no older than 6 squealed with delight as she found a shiny penny near the base of a stop sign. She held it up to her mother, who smiled and nodded encouragingly. George shook his head in disbelief. All this, over a few pennies? Lisa touched his arm gently. Not just pennies, Dad. What they stand for. Everyone's looking for something to believe in these days. You gave them that. They continued walking, George lost in thought. By the time they made it back home, a small crowd had gathered outside his house, neighbors, mostly, but there were a few strangers as well. A man in a crisp suit stepped forward, extending his hand as George approached. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked with a practiced smile. "My name's Martin Foster. I represent a foundation that's interested in partnering with you." George frowned, eyeing the man warily. "Partnering? For what?" "To expand what you've already started," Martin replied smoothly. "Your story has touched so many lives, and we believe it could be even bigger. Imagine schools across the country hosting penny drives. Imagine communities coming together to collect change for good causes. We could help you set up a formal charity, something that lasts for generations." George stared at the man, his mind spinning. A formal charity? Schools and communities coming together? It all sounded so grand, so impossible. "I don't know about all that," George said gruffly. "I'm just a man with some pennies." "With respect, sir," Martin replied, "you're a man with a movement." That night, George sat alone in his living room, staring at the jar of pennies Evelyn had sent. He turned one of the coins over in his hand, its surface worn and dull. "God's little reminders," he whispered again. Margaret had always been the one who believed in big dreams. She'd been the one to stop and pick flowers from the side of the road, the one to talk to strangers at the grocery store, the one to leave handwritten notes in George's lunchbox when he still worked at the factory. "It's the little things, George," she'd always say with that soft smile. "The little things hold the world together." The following morning, George made a decision. He asked Lisa to call Martin Foster back, and by lunchtime, the man in the crisp suit was sitting across from George at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread out before him. "This isn't just about money," George said firmly, pointing a finger at Martin. "If I'm going to do this, it has to mean something. I don't want it turning into one of those fancy foundations that forget what it's about." "Of course," Martin replied smoothly. "We'll keep the mission simple, helping people, one penny at a time. We'll start local, fund families and small projects that need it most. You'll have the final say on everything." George leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "I don't care about the credit. I just want to do right by Margaret. And by all the people sending me their pennies." Martin nodded, scribbling something down in his notebook. "We'll make sure of that, Mr. Thompson." Over the next few weeks, the charity took shape. They called it Pennies for Purpose, a simple name that reflected everything George wanted it to be. The jars that once cluttered George's garage were now symbols of hope, printed on flyers and posters sent to schools, churches, and community centers across the country. Donations poured in faster than anyone could have imagined. Jake set up a website, complete with a tracker showing how much had been raised and where the funds were going. George's story continued to spread, and soon, families from all over were sharing their own penny stories, how the smallest acts of kindness had changed their lives. George watched it all unfold from his armchair, feeling equal parts pride and disbelief. Every now and then, he'd run his fingers over the edge of one of Margaret's mason jars, his mind drifting back to those quiet evenings spent counting pennies by her side. One night, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, George sat on his porch with Jake beside him. The boy had his laptop open, reading off updates from the website. "We just hit $250,000, Grandpa," Jake said, grinning. "Can you believe it? $250,000. George shook his head slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All from a bunch of forgotten pennies," he murmured. Jake nodded, closing the laptop. "People say you're a hero, you know." "I'm no hero," George replied softly. "I'm just a man who paid attention to the little things." As the stars began to appear overhead, George leaned back in his chair, listening to the distant hum of life carrying on around him. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, like he'd finally found the path Margaret had always believed was waiting for him. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by jars of pennies and the echoes of a life well lived, George Thompson knew that the smallest things truly could change the world. As the sun rose over the Thompson household one crisp autumn morning, the faint chill of the season lingered in the air, signaling both an ending and a beginning. George sat on his porch as he did most mornings now, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching the world awaken. Cars rumbled down the street, kids hurried off to school, and parents waved goodbye. Life moved on, steady, relentless, but for George, it felt different. There was meaning in the movement now, in the tiniest moments he once would have overlooked. The clinking of loose change in a mason jar echoed through the house as Jake appeared, holding a freshly sealed donation envelope. The boy had grown into his role as George's partner in this unexpected venture. It amazed George to see how the spark of an idea had transformed not only him but also his family. Jake had once spent his days glued to video games or grumbling through homework, but now his energy had a purpose. "Morning, Grandpa." Jake called as he pushed open the screen door, plopping himself onto the porch step. "We just got another email from the mayor's office. They want us at some charity event next month. Fancy people, I guess." George grunted, shaking his head. "Another event? I'm starting to think they've got nothing better to do than invite me to places I don't belong." "You belong, Grandpa," Jake insisted. "You're the reason all this is happening." George sighed, staring at his cane leaned against the side of the chair. "Maybe so, but I didn't ask for any of this." "And yet, here you are," Jake said with a grin. "Margaret would be proud, you know." The mention of Margaret's name tugged at George's heart in that familiar way, equal parts ache and comfort. For months now, everything he had done, everything that had grown out of his simple jar of pennies, had been for her. He could feel her presence in the hum of activity surrounding him, in the hands of strangers offering coins, and in the letters that arrived daily, full of gratitude and hope. She was everywhere, woven into the fabric of what this had become. "Anyway," Jake continued, "Mom says we've got one last donation to deliver today. Some school fundraiser uptown. Want to come with me?" George hesitated, rubbing his knuckles against his knee. He wasn't fond of leaving the house much these days. The spotlight that came with all this pennies for purpose business made him uneasy. But Jake's hopeful expression convinced him to agree. "All right," George said with a grumble, though he couldn't hide the faint smile pulling at his lips. "Let's get on with it." The drive uptown was longer than George expected, but he didn't mind. Jake took the back roads, winding through quiet neighborhoods where trees blazed orange and red in the sunlight. George watched the scenery roll past, the warmth of the day sinking into his bones. He felt something settle within him, a calm he hadn't known in years. "Here we are," Jake said, pulling up in front of a small, aging elementary school. Kids were running across the playground, their laughter carrying through the open windows. A banner stretched across the entrance, "Pennies for Purpose, thank you, Mr. Thompson." George groaned softly. "Did they have to put my name on it?" Jake laughed, hopping out of the car. "You're a hero, Grandpa. Get used to it." As they stepped through the school's double doors, George was met with the eager chatter of children waiting in the gymnasium. The place buzzed with energy, tables covered in jars, bottles, and boxes filled with coins. Teachers bustled around, clapping their hands and ushering kids into lines. At the front of the room, a makeshift stage had been set up with a microphone. "Mr. Thompson," a woman's voice called. A middle-aged teacher hurried over, her smile bright and genuine. "We are so honored to have you here. The kids have been working so hard for this day." George adjusted his cap uncomfortably. "Well, it's kind of you to say so, but I'm no one special." "Nonsense," she replied, placing a warm hand on his arm. "The smallest things matter most. That's what we've been teaching these kids. And they've taken it to heart." Before George could protest, Jake was helping him up onto the stage. The gym grew quiet as rows of eager, young faces turned toward him. George cleared his throat awkwardly, gripping the edges of his jacket. Speaking in front of people had never been his strong suit, but there was no turning back now.
Well, he began, his voice crackling in the microphone, I'm George Thompson. I guess most of you know that already. A ripple of laughter filled the room. Truth be told, I didn't set out to do much. Just started saving pennies in a jar. A lot of them, over a lot of years. My wife, Margaret, she believed in the little things. The small moments. The pennies nobody paid attention to. And, well, I guess I started believing in them too. George paused, looking out at the crowd of children. Here's the thing. Life's made up of little things. The smiles you share with someone having a hard day. Holding the door for a stranger. Saying thank you when someone does something kind. It doesn't take much to make a difference. Just paying attention. He looked down at Jake, who was beaming up at him from the front row. Pride swelled in George's chest as he continued. I'm not a hero, he said softly. I'm just an old man with some jars of coins. But I've learned something these past few months. It's not about how much you have. It's about what you do with it. A wave of applause erupted as George stepped back from the microphone. He grumbled under his breath as Jake helped him off the stage. Too much fuss, he muttered, though the redness in his cheeks betrayed his pride. The principal announced that the fundraiser had been the most successful in the school's history, enough to buy supplies, fix playground equipment, and help families in need. As children lined up to drop their pennies into a final collection jar, George watched, his heart full. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, a little girl said as she handed him a shiny penny. I picked this one special for you. George knelt carefully, taking the coin from her tiny hand. Why's this one special, sweetheart? Because it's lucky, she whispered with a toothy grin. And I wanted you to have it. For a moment, George couldn't speak. He turned the penny over in his fingers, the light catching its copper surface. Lucky. God's little reminders. That evening, as Jake drove them home, George stared out the window, the little girl's penny warm in his palm. The road stretched out before them, bathed in the golden glow of sunset, and for the first time in years, George felt whole. He thought of Margaret, her smile, her laughter, her belief in the beauty of small things. When they pulled into the driveway, Jake turned to his grandfather. So what now, Grandpa? You've built a whole charity, inspired half the country, and saved more pennies than anyone I know. What's next? George looked down at the penny in his hand, a smile playing at his lips. I'll keep going, he said simply. One penny at a time. In the weeks that followed, Pennies for Purpose grew beyond anything George could have imagined. Schools, churches, and entire communities held penny drives. Strangers sent letters sharing stories of hope, faith, and kindness. And through it all, George stayed the same, a man with a jar of coins, reminding the world that little things mattered. One evening, as George sat alone on his porch, a breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves. He closed his eyes and listened to the quiet hum of the world around him. And in that moment, he swore he could hear Margaret's voice, a whisper carried on the wind. It's the little things, George, she said. He opened his eyes, his gaze falling on the mason jar beside him, half full of shiny, forgotten pennies. With a steady hand, he picked one up and held it to the fading light, the copper glinting like a promise. George Thompson smiled. Because he knew now, with certainty, that the smallest things could change the world. And sometimes, they did.